Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a kitchen. Not just any kitchen. A hot, smoky, fire-lit room where the most important culinary revolution in American history quietly took place, one iron pot at a time, in the hands of people who were never supposed to get credit for it. Tonight we're talking about soul food. The real story, not the version that ends with a Thanksgiving plate and a warm feeling, but the one that begins on the shores of West Africa, travels through the horror of the Middle Passage, survives the cruelty of plantation life, and emerges on the other side as one of the most influential cuisines the world has ever tasted. You think you know this story. You've had the fried chicken. You've had the collard greens. Maybe you've sat at a Sunday dinner table and felt the kind of warmth that food can carry when it's made with something more than just ingredients. But here's the thing about soul food that the cookbooks and the comfort food blogs don't fully capture. Every dish on that table is a document. Every recipe is a survival story. Every bite carries the fingerprints of people who were told they were nothing, who were given the worst of everything, and who transformed that worst into something so extraordinary that the whole country eventually stole it, repackaged it, and forgot to mention where it came from. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight and what your absolute favorite soul food dish is. The one that takes you somewhere. The one that tastes like memory. I want to know. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Maybe pull a blanket up. Get yourself something warm to drink. Not from a packet. Something your grandmother would recognize. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered who actually invented the dishes you grew up calling American food? Have you ever asked where fried chicken really came from, and whether the answer surprises you? Did you know that the sweet potatoes on your plate carry a direct line back to West African soil? That the okra in your gumbo came across the Atlantic in the hands of people who had nothing else to hold on to? That the technique behind your slow-cooked greens was refined in plantation quarters by women who had no legal right to the recipes in their own heads? Did you know that the man who introduced macaroni and cheese to the United States was enslaved? That he trained in Paris? That he ran a kitchen that served America's founding fathers? And that history spent 2 centuries giving all the credit to his enslaver? Did you know that rice cultivation in South Carolina, the crop that made entire dynasties of white planters obscenely wealthy, was only possible because of agricultural knowledge stolen from people who had been growing rice on the rice coast of West Africa for thousands of years? And did you ever wonder what it felt like to cook a meal that you were never fully allowed to eat, to feed a table you were never allowed to sit at, and to watch the people who owned you take credit for a genius that was yours? Congratulations. You've just woken up somewhere around 1820 on a plantation in the Deep South, in a kitchen that is technically attached to the main house, but might as well be in another world. The fire has been going since before dawn. It never really goes out. The air in this room is thick. Smoke hangs in layers, wood smoke from the hearth, the deep, fatty smell of salt pork rendering in a cast iron skillet, something sweeter underneath it all. Maybe dried corn or sweet potato. Maybe the ghost of last night's greens still clinging to the walls. The ceiling is low and black with soot. The floor is packed dirt, cool underfoot, worn smooth by decades of feet moving in the same careful patterns. There are hooks along one wall hung with dried herbs, bundles of things you brought in from the garden yourself, from the half-acre plot you tend after your own labor is done. Thyme, sage, dried pepper pods that burn red-orange in the firelight, a twist of something that doesn't have a proper English name because the English name for it doesn't exist. It came with you from somewhere older than this place. You know this kitchen the way you know your own hands. You know which stone on the hearth runs hot, which pot holds heat longest, which corner of the room is coolest for keeping things from turning. You know all of this because you have been doing this work since you were old enough to carry a bucket, and because the woman who taught you learned from another woman before her. A chain of knowledge stretching back through generations and across an ocean. The knowledge is yours. The kitchen, technically, is not. Here's the thing about the story of soul food that most people miss when they talk about it. The conversation usually starts with poverty, with rations, with scraps and leftovers and making do. And all of that is true. The material conditions of slavery shaped what went into the pot. And those constraints are part of the story. But the story that only starts with poverty misses the most important part. It misses the expertise. It misses the fact that the people who cooked in these kitchens were not simply improvising with garbage. They were skilled practitioners of culinary traditions that predated American slavery by millennia. They were bringing knowledge to this continent that the people who enslaved them desperately needed, and in many cases literally could not survive without. Let's go back further, much further. Let's go to West Africa, where the true roots of this story are planted. Long before the first enslaved African was forced onto a ship, the western and central regions of the African continent were home to some of the most sophisticated agricultural and culinary traditions in the world. We are talking about cultures that had been cultivating rice, sorghum, millet, black-eyed peas, okra, and a dozen varieties of leafy greens for thousands of years. Cultures that had developed complex techniques for one-pot stewing, for smoking and preserving meat, for deep frying in palm oil, for using every part of an animal because you respected the animal, and because waste was a concept that made no sense when you were feeding a community. Cultures that understood flavor not as an accident, but as an architecture, built deliberately from layered spices, from fermentation, from fat and acid and heat used in proportions that had been tested and refined and passed down through oral tradition for generations. The rice-growing expertise of West Africa deserves its own conversation because it is one of the most remarkable and most thoroughly buried stories in American agricultural history. In the regions stretching from modern-day Senegal down through Sierra Leone, an area that colonial traders literally called the Rice Coast. Peoples like the Mende, the Baga, the Susu, and the Kissi had been cultivating rice in both upland dry fields and flooded lowland paddies for 2,000 years or more. They had developed sophisticated irrigation systems, water management techniques, and varietal knowledge that European colonists simply did not possess. When British planters in South Carolina in the early 1700s looked at the low, swampy coastline of the Low Country and realized that the conditions were perfect for rice cultivation, they faced a problem. They had no idea how to grow it, so they went to the slave markets, and they specifically asked for Africans from the Rice Coast. They paid premium prices for people from those regions because they needed their brains, they needed their knowledge, and then they used that knowledge to build an agricultural empire, pocketed the profits, and for 2.5 centuries, the history books credited the innovation to the planters who owned the plantations, rather than to the African farmers who actually made the fields productive. One historian has noted that more earth was moved to build the rice plantation infrastructure of coastal South Carolina than was moved to build the pyramids at Giza. That labor and that engineering genius belonged to the ancestors of the Gula Geechee people, who maintained so much of their West African cultural identity, precisely because the isolation of the sea islands gave them room to breathe. But rice is only the beginning. Picture the middle passage. And I want you to hold that image carefully, because it's important to this story, even though it's almost unbearable to think about. On those ships, people were packed into spaces that defied humanity. They were dying. They were sick. They were in conditions that were designed to strip every fragment of identity from them. And yet, and this is the thing that amazes me every time I think about it, some of them managed to bring seeds, not metaphorically, literally, okra seeds, sesame seeds, which in West Africa were called ben, black-eyed peas, hot peppers. Some accounts suggest that seeds were braided into hair, sewn into clothing, carried in whatever small space a person's body could conceal. When the ships docked and the people were sold, and the nightmare of the auction block began, those seeds came with them. Think about what that means. In the most violent, dehumanizing moment of their lives, people held on to the possibility of planting something, of growing something, of tasting eventually something that tasted like where they came from. Okra is one of the most direct lines from West Africa to the American table. The word itself comes from the Igbo language of modern Nigeria, okuru. In West African cooking, okra does double duty. It's a vegetable and a thickener, the ingredient that gives stews their characteristic richness and body. When enslaved people arrived in the American South and began planting their small subsistence gardens, okra went in. When they began improvising around the meager rations given to them by planters, okra went into the pot. When Louisiana cooks, working across a collision of French, Spanish, Native American, and African culinary traditions, began developing gumbo, that extraordinary dish that is in many ways the most perfect metaphor for American culture. It was African okra that gave the dish its name. Gumbo comes from the Bantu word for okra, kingombo. The dish is named after an African vegetable. Every time you eat gumbo, you are eating a dish that carries its African origins in its very name. Every time. Black-eyed peas arrived the same way. They are native to West Africa, brought to the Americas on slave ships, and immediately integrated into the food traditions of the enslaved. They're hardy. They grow in poor soil. They don't require the intensive cultivation of cotton or tobacco. You can grow them in the margins, in the small plots that were sometimes allocated to enslaved people, in the corners of fields, in secret gardens tended after dark. They became a survival food. They became a community food. They became, eventually, a symbol of luck and prosperity, eaten at New Year's in a tradition that connects directly back to West African ritual. The dish, called Hoppin' John, black-eyed peas cooked with rice and fatback, is West African agriculture and West African cooking technique meeting whatever the plantation was willing to provide and creating something that endures 2 centuries later. Sweet potatoes are a different kind of story. The sweet potato is native to the Americas. It was cultivated here long before Europeans arrived. But when enslaved Africans encountered it, they immediately recognized something in it. There's a root vegetable in West African cooking, the yam, that occupies a similar role. Starchy, sweet, deeply nourishing, versatile. The substitution was intuitive. The techniques that West African cooks used on yams, baking them, mashing them, combining them with spices and fat and sugar, transferred almost directly to the sweet potato. Candied yams, that's West African culinary logic applied to an American ingredient. Sweet potato pie, that's a synthesis of West African flavor tradition and European pastry technique made in plantation kitchens by black hands. The dish that shows up at Thanksgiving tables across the country, that people call quintessentially American, grew out of a culinary memory carried across the Atlantic by people who were being told to forget where they came from. And they never forgot. Now let's talk about the rations, because this is where the real alchemy happened. What enslaved people were given to work with was, by design, the minimum. The arithmetic of slavery was brutal and explicit. Give people just enough to keep them functional, no more. A typical weekly ration might be a peck of cornmeal, about 8 pounds, and 3 to 4 pounds of pork. Usually the worst parts of the pork: the intestines, the feet, the hocks, the ears, the jowl, the crackling, the fat bag, the parts that the planter's family would not eat. Sometimes some molasses, sometimes dried beans, sometimes nothing but the cornmeal and whatever you could forage or grow yourself. Here's the thing about being given the worst parts of the pig. It requires skill to make them good. Real skill. The transformation of a pig's intestine into something edible, let alone something delicious, is not a matter of luck. It requires knowledge of how to clean them thoroughly, a process that takes hours, knowledge of how long to cook them, at what temperature, with what seasonings. The same is true of the hock, of the ear, of the foot. These are not forgiving cuts. They don't become magnificent accidentally. They become magnificent because generations of cooks worked out exactly how to handle them, exactly what flavors complement their specific fatty richness, exactly how long the low-slow heat needs to work before the collagen breaks down and the meat begins to yield. The techniques that enslaved cooks developed for handling these scraps: slow braising, long simmering, the patient application of time and heat, became the backbone of what we now call Southern cooking. And crucially, they didn't develop these techniques from nothing. They came into plantation kitchens with existing knowledge of how to handle difficult cuts, how to layer flavor over time, how to use spice and acid and smoke to transform something humble into something that fills a room with its smell. They came from culinary traditions that had always understood the value of using everything, of wasting nothing, of treating even the least glamorous ingredient with respect, because it was going to have to feed people. The seasoning of soul food has its own genealogy that runs directly back to West and Central Africa. Hot peppers are central to this story. Malagueta pepper, also called grains of paradise, was a West African spice that had been traded to Europe for centuries before the slave trade began. Enslaved people from West African regions, where hot peppers were dietary staples, maintained that preference in America, using whatever peppers they could grow or obtain. A Swedish-Finnish botanist traveling through Philadelphia in 1748 noted that enslaved Africans were cultivating hot peppers and making sauces from them, pounding the pods and mixing them with salt and vinegar in bottles. Sound familiar? That's hot sauce. That's the ancestor of Louisiana hot sauce and every hot sauce on every table in the American South. The entire hot sauce tradition of American cuisine has its roots in West African seasoning practice, developed and maintained by enslaved people. Barbecue is another case where African culinary tradition is hiding in plain sight. The technique of cooking meat low and slow over open flame with a sauce applied during or after cooking. This is described in accounts from West Africa that predate American barbecue by centuries. African women cooked meats over open fire pits and dressed them with sauces made from citrus and hot peppers. When enslaved people in the South were tasked with managing the barbecue pits, and they were almost universally the people who did this work, because it required skill, and because it was hot, hard labor. They brought those techniques with them. The vinegar and pepper sauces of the Carolinas, the tomato and smoke complexity of Memphis, the dry rubs of Texas. All of these regional styles have their roots in African technique applied to American wood and American meat. The people who mastered these techniques were enslaved. The barbecue tradition they built became one of America's most beloved culinary institutions, and most of the histories written about it for most of the 20th century somehow managed not to mention any of this. You are still in that kitchen. The fire crackles. Outside, you can hear the field horn, the sound that governs everyone else's morning. But this kitchen runs on a different rhythm. There's no horn for the cook's work. The cook's work started before the horn and will end long after everyone else has stopped. You are, in the hierarchy of plantation labor, neither at the bottom nor at the top, but you are in a position of certain strange power, the power of the person who feeds everyone, the planter's family at the main house table, the overseer, and in the evenings, in a different set of pots, your own people. The two sets of pots are never confused. What goes to the main house is different from what comes to the quarters. What goes to the main house is the better cut, the finer preparation, the carefully seasoned roast, or the delicate French-style sauce you learn from a cookbook, or from watching and copying and improving on what you saw. What comes to the quarters is built from what's left, from the rations, from what you can grow and forage and trade and stretch. And here's the secret that the history of American cuisine doesn't like to say clearly. Both of those tables owe everything to black culinary knowledge. The main house table gets the technique. The quarters table gets the heart. Let's talk about the main house, because this is where one of the most extraordinary and most invisible stories in American food history played out. The cooks who worked in plantation house kitchens were not untrained laborers improvising over a fire. They were professional chefs, in every meaningful sense of that word, who happened to be enslaved. They managed complex kitchens with multiple hearths and multiple cooking processes happening simultaneously. They planned menus. They trained apprentices. They executed complicated preparations that required precise timing, temperature control, and detailed knowledge of ingredients. They fed the social and political elite of early America, and in doing so, they shaped American cuisine at the highest level. The most famous and most tragic example of this is James Hemings. Born in 1765, enslaved from birth, the son of the plantation owner John Wales and the enslaved woman Elizabeth Hemings, which meant that when Wales died and his son-in-law Thomas Jefferson inherited his estate, James Hemings was suddenly the property of the man who had just become his half-sister Sally's enslaver and, ultimately, the father of her children. Jefferson took James with him to France in 1784, when Hemings was 19 years old. He was sent to train with the great French chefs of Paris. He worked in the household of a prince. He ran Jefferson's official kitchen at the Hôtel de Langeac on the Champs-Élysées, managing a team of staff, serving diplomatic guests, executing menus of extraordinary sophistication. He became, by any reasonable standard, one of the finest chefs of his era. And then he came back to America, still enslaved. The dishes that James Hemings brought back from France changed American food. Macaroni and cheese, not the thing from a box, the original dish. A rich baked preparation of imported pasta, and aged cheese that was at the time a luxury item associated with European sophistication, came to America through the Monticello kitchen that Hemings ran. French fries, ice cream, crème brûlée, meringues. These dishes entered the American diet through a kitchen operated by an enslaved black man who spoke fluent French, who had trained under masters, who had an extraordinary gift that Jefferson was happy to exploit and equally happy to take credit for. Jefferson has long been described as America's first great food enthusiast, the president who introduced macaroni and cheese and ice cream to the new republic. The name that tends to be missing from that story is Hemings. Hemings eventually negotiated his freedom, a process that itself tells you something about the world he was navigating. He had to negotiate with his enslaver for the right to his own body and life. The terms were, he would train his brother Peter as a replacement chef, a process that took 3 years. In 1796, he received his manumission. He was 30 years old. He had spent his adult life cooking for the Founding Fathers, introducing French cuisine to America, operating at the highest level of his craft, and receiving in return wages that were less than his white counterparts, and a freedom that came only when his enslaver was satisfied that his skills had been successfully transferred to another piece of his property. James Hemings died 5 years after his manumission, at 36. The causes were complex, and the grief behind them is not hard to imagine. The story of James Hemings is the story of soul food in miniature. Extraordinary talent, extraordinary knowledge, extraordinary contribution, and a history that spent centuries looking past it. Now let's pull back to the quarters, because that's where the tradition we're tracing tonight actually lives. The plantation kitchen is one strand of this story. The slave quarters kitchen is another, and in some ways it's the more powerful one, because the food made there had no audience to impress, no planter to satisfy, no European sophistication to perform. The food made in the quarters was made for the community, and it was made with something that culinary historians have a hard time quantifying, but that every person who has eaten a great meal made by someone who loved them understands completely. It was made with care, with the specific, fierce care of people who were being told constantly that they did not matter, insisting through the act of cooking and feeding and gathering together that they did. The quarters meal was a collective act. In many plantation communities, women who had been laboring in fields or in the main house since before dawn came together in the evenings to cook. The fire pit in front of the quarters cabins was a communal space. The large cast iron pot, a 3-legged pot that sat over an open fire and could cook a whole meal, was often shared. What went into it was whatever there was. The rations of cornmeal and pork supplemented by whatever had been grown in the small garden plots, whatever had been caught from the creek or the riverbank, whatever could be foraged from the edges of the plantation. Fishing was both a practical necessity and for many a small refuge. The hour or two spent at the water's edge with a line was one of the few moments of something like peace in a life structured entirely around labor for someone else's benefit. The collard greens that became one of the signature elements of soul food have a direct line back to West Africa. Leafy greens cooked low and slow in a seasoned liquid. A pot liquor, as the cooking liquid came to be called, is a preparation found throughout African cooking traditions. In West Africa, leafy greens are prepared with everything from fermented locust bean paste to palm oil to smoked fish. In the plantation quarters, what you had was collard greens and a piece of salt pork or a ham hock, the smoked and cured pork bone that gave the pot its depth of flavor. The slow cooking drew the flavor out of the pork and into the greens, and the cooking liquid itself, salty, smoky, lightly bitter from the greens, rich with the fat rendered from the hock, became a food in its own right. You sopped it up with cornbread. You didn't waste a drop. Cornbread is its own chapter. Corn, or maize, is a crop native to the Americas, cultivated by indigenous people for thousands of years before European contact. When enslaved Africans encountered it, they recognized it as another form of grain, and they approached it with the kind of culinary intelligence that had already worked out what to do with sorghum and millet back home. Cornmeal became a staple of the plantation ration because corn was cheap and filling and easy to grow. What enslaved cooks did with cornmeal, the range of preparations they developed, from simple ash cake baked directly in the coals of a fire to skillet cornbread to hoe cakes cooked on a flat iron over the fire's edge, represents a level of improvisation and creative problem solving that is genuinely remarkable. There were no measuring cups. There was no cookbook. There was knowledge in your hands and fire in front of you and hungry people waiting. And what you made from that needed to be good enough to carry a person through the next day's labor. The cast iron pot deserves a moment of attention because it is one of the most important objects in this entire story. Iron cookware has been used in West and Central Africa for centuries. When enslaved people arrived in America, the heavy three-legged iron pot was already a familiar tool. It matched something from home. The American plantation issued it as a piece of labor equipment. For the people who used it, it was also a piece of cultural continuity. The one-pot meal is one of the foundational structures of West African cooking. You put in everything you have, you cook it low and slow, and the pot does the work of combining all the flavors into something unified and deep. Gumbo is this, Brunswick stew is this, the humble pot of greens and hock is this, the slow simmered beans that simmer all day are this. The pot is not just a vessel, it is a philosophy. Let's talk about the garden plots, because they matter more than most accounts give them credit for. On many plantations, enslaved people were given small pieces of land, sometimes just a quarter acre, sometimes a little more, where they could grow their own vegetables. The purpose of this arrangement, from the planter's perspective, was economic. Growing your own food supplemented the rations and reduced the expense of feeding the people you'd enslaved. From the perspective of the people doing the gardening, the purpose was something else entirely. Those garden plots were one of the only spaces in plantation life that belonged to you in any meaningful sense. The decisions about what to plant were yours. The labor was yours. The crop was yours. And what they planted tells you everything about culinary memory and cultural preservation. Okra went in. Cowpeas, black-eyed peas and their cousins went in. Hot peppers went in. Greens of various kinds. Sweet potatoes, which grew reliably and needed relatively little attention. Sorghum, when they could get it. Watermelon, which is not the stereotype that American racism made of it, but a fruit with deep roots in African agriculture. It's native to sub-Saharan Africa and was a dietary staple long before it became a tool of mockery. In these small gardens, enslaved people were effectively maintaining a botanical connection to the continent they had been forced to leave. They were growing their memory. Some of what they grew, they ate. Some of it they sold. In the informal markets that existed on and around plantations, markets where enslaved people traded with each other, with free black people, sometimes with white people who wanted the specific produce these gardens were producing. These markets were often technically illegal, or at least technically unauthorized, but they existed anyway, because commerce is one of those human activities that tends to find a way regardless of who is trying to stop it, and they represent something important. Even within the brutal economic structure of slavery, black people were finding ways to participate in an economy on their own terms, however limited those terms were. The fish and game that supplemented plantation rations is another dimension of the story that tends to get compressed in popular accounts. Hunting and fishing were not just pastimes. They were survival strategies. A man with a fishing line and a few hours at the creek could bring home protein that the plantation rations didn't provide. A woman who knew which plants at the edge of the forest were edible could supplement the rations with greens or tubers or berries that the planter had never thought to account for. This kind of knowledge, what to look for, where to find it, how to prepare it, was another form of the expertise that enslaved people carried and transmitted. It was knowledge that had parallels in West African traditions of hunting and foraging, adapted to a new environment through decades of careful observation. Squirrel and rabbit and possum weren't delicacies, they were necessity. But they were prepared with the same attention and the same layering of technique that went into every other dish in the quarters. Squirrel stew with whatever greens were available. Fried rabbit with cornmeal. Roasted possum, which has a distinctive flavor that requires specific preparation to balance. Too much fat, needs to be rendered properly, needs strong seasoning, needs long cooking. People who make these things today, who grew up eating them in rural southern communities, are inheritors of traditions developed by people who had very little choice but to make the most of whatever the land offered. They made the most, and then they passed it on. The Sunday meal was the one meal of the week that was allowed to be something more. On most plantations, Sunday was technically a day of rest, not for compassionate reasons, but because keeping enslaved people on a grinding 7-day schedule was economically counterproductive. The rest was an investment in productivity. But for the people who got it, Sunday rest was something else. It was time. Time to cook without rushing. Time to gather. Time to do something closer to what eating can be at its best, which is an act of community. Picture a Sunday afternoon in the quarters, somewhere in Georgia, late in the antebellum period. The smell of something slow cooking has been in the air since morning. Maybe a big pot of soup with a ham bone and whatever vegetables are available. Maybe a whole chicken, a luxury that doesn't happen every week, turning over a fire or frying in a pan with fat that has been carefully saved all week. The cornbread will be made fresh. Maybe a sweet potato pie if there's sugar to be had, if the molasses in the ration stretches that far. People will gather. Children will be everywhere. Someone will have a fiddle. The food will be distributed not just to immediate family, but to neighbors whose ration came up short, to the elderly who couldn't do as much for themselves, to the woman who just had a baby and needed feeding. This is how the food tradition of soul food also became a social tradition. The gathering, the generosity, the understanding that feeding each other is how a community survives when nothing else is protecting it. This communal ethic. The understanding that food is for sharing, that you make enough for whoever shows up, that a plate turned away is a kind of violence, runs all the way through Black American food culture, from the plantation quarters to the church dinner, to the present-day grandmother who always makes too much because she grew up in a family where you never knew when someone else might need to eat. The cooking is the love. The feeding is the statement, I matter and you matter. And the fact that we are eating together is proof. Let's move forward in time. The Civil War ends in 1865. The Emancipation Proclamation has been in effect since 1863 for enslaved people in Confederate states. Though for many people, the practical fact of freedom didn't arrive until Union soldiers showed up with the news, sometimes years later. Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, is the date when enslaved people in Texas finally received word that the war was over and they were free. 4 million people suddenly free, with no property, no land, no money, and in most cases no legal protections worth having. They had their labor, their knowledge, and their traditions. Food was among the most important of those traditions, because food had been one of the primary ways that black communities had sustained themselves under slavery, and it would continue to be one of the primary ways they built new lives. The period immediately after emancipation was one of extraordinary creativity and also extraordinary suffering. Freed people who stayed in the South, and many did, because the South was home, because family was there, because they had nowhere else to go, found themselves in a new system that was designed to replicate as many of the economic structures of slavery as possible. Sharecropping tied black families to land they didn't own, creating cycles of debt that were in many cases literally impossible to escape. The cropland system meant that the food you grew and harvested was always already spoken for, always already collateral for a debt that seemed to grow faster than any crop could pay it. And yet, the food traditions continued, the kitchen gardens continued, the church dinners continued, the communal cooking continued. The church became the most important institution in post-slavery black American life, and the food associated with it became one of the most powerful ongoing expressions of soul food tradition. Church dinners, homecoming celebrations, fish fries after Sunday service. These were not incidental. They were central. They were where the community gathered, where news was shared and alliances formed and disputes settled and marriages made and grief processed. They were where the best cooks showed their work, and where the tradition of competitive church cooking, who made the best pound cake, whose fried chicken couldn't be touched, whose sweet potato pie made grown people stop mid-conversation, began its long run as one of the great informal competitive traditions in American culture. Fried chicken deserves a particularly careful telling because it has been so thoroughly claimed and so thoroughly misunderstood. Here's the actual history. Frying chicken in fat is a technique that has multiple origins, and the version that became quintessential American soul food, fried chicken, highly seasoned, coated in seasoned flour, fried in fat until golden and crisp, carries an African fingerprint. The specific technique of seasoning the chicken before cooking, coating it in spiced flour, and frying it at high heat comes from West African traditions of deep frying in palm oil. The Scottish brought their own fried chicken traditions to the American South, and those traditions intersected with African technique in the plantation kitchen. But the flavor, the spicing, the specific character of soul food fried chicken, that is African. Enslaved women were often the first to make money of their own through fried chicken. In the years after emancipation, free black women in southern cities would cook chicken and sell it from baskets or from market tables to travelers, to workers, to anyone who needed to eat. It was one of the few economic opportunities available to them. Scholars have documented how black women built entire small economies around the sale of food, particularly fried chicken, at railroad stations and in city markets across the South and later the North. These women were, in practical terms, operating small food businesses in conditions of extreme economic constraint, taking a culinary tradition that had been maintained in bondage and transforming it into the first thread of black commercial food culture. They were the original restaurateurs of soul food. The Great Migration carried soul food northward. Beginning around 1910 and accelerating sharply through the 1940s and 1950s, some 6 million black Americans left the South for northern cities: Chicago, Detroit, New York, Cleveland, Philadelphia. They left looking for work, for safety, for lives that weren't hemmed in at every turn by Jim Crow. They brought their food with them. The restaurants and soul food joints that sprang up in black neighborhoods in Chicago's South Side, in Harlem, in Detroit's Black Bottom neighborhood. These were not just eating establishments. They were anchor points of community. They were places where you could walk in from a northern winter and smell something that took you back south, that reminded you of who you were before the factory and the tenement and the specific cold of a city that had never quite decided whether it wanted you or not. Sylvia Woods opened Sylvia's restaurant in Harlem in 1962. She had come north from South Carolina, where her family had sharecropped, and she brought with her not just recipes but a way of cooking and a way of receiving people that had its roots in everything we've been talking about tonight. The restaurant became an institution, eventually called the Queen of Soul Food, not because of culinary innovation, but because of culinary continuity. The fried chicken and the collard greens and the cornbread at Sylvia's tasted the way they tasted because they carried the knowledge of the women who had cooked those dishes before Sylvia and before them and before them. In the 1960s, when the word soul food came into common use, it came in as a political statement as much as a culinary description. The civil rights era was a moment of intense cultural assertion, black power, black pride, the claim that black culture was not inferior, not something to be ashamed of, not something to be abandoned in the pursuit of assimilation. Soul food was part of that assertion. To claim soul food as yours, to cook it and eat it with pride rather than embarrassment, was to make a statement about the value of black cultural tradition against a dominant culture that had spent centuries appropriating it, while simultaneously looking down on it. The same food that was described as poverty food, as the diet of an inferior people, was suddenly being claimed as a heritage, a birthright, a source of pride. But even in that moment of reclamation, the irony was enormous. The food that white America had been eating for generations, the fried chicken, the barbecue, the greens, the cornbread, the sweet potatoes, had almost all come from black kitchens, black hands, black knowledge. The Southern cooking that millions of white Americans considered their heritage was in enormous measure the cuisine that their ancestors had learned from the enslaved people who cooked their food. The recipes that passed into white families' consciousness as traditional Southern dishes were in many cases exactly the dishes developed in the plantation kitchen, in the quarters, in the church hall, in the freed women's market stall. The food had traveled, the credit had not. This pattern of appropriation runs through the entire history of American food. The barbecue joints of the 20th century that made their fortunes in white suburban markets were selling techniques developed by black pitmasters. The catfish and hush puppy tradition of the rural South, black. The sweet tea that Southerners claim as a birthright. The technique of steeping herbs and sweetened beverages comes directly from West African tradition, where similar drinks were common. Hot sauce, the Louisiana-style hot sauces that became staples of American tables and eventually billion-dollar industries. Rooted in the West African pepper sauce tradition, maintained by enslaved people. And mac and cheese, the mac and cheese that became one of the most ubiquitous comfort foods in America, that appears on children's menus in every diner in the country, that has its own holiday devoted to it, came to America through an enslaved black man who ran a kitchen on the Champs-Élysées and whose name most Americans have never been told. Let's go back to the kitchen. Back to you, standing at the hearth in 1820, because there's more to explore in that space before we move forward. The cookware in this kitchen was not chosen randomly. The heavy cast iron pots and skillets were the standard issue of plantation cooking, but they were also, as I mentioned, objects of cultural familiarity. But there were other tools here too, and they carry their own stories. The wooden spoons, carved sometimes by hand, the flatboards used for rolling out dough, the long-handled ladles, the small earthenware crocks used for fermentation. Because fermentation was a fundamental technique of African cooking that enslaved people maintained in America. Fermented vegetables, fermented grain drinks, the sour, tangy, deeply funky flavors that fermentation produces were part of the flavor vocabulary that black cooks kept alive. And you can taste them in the vinegar-based sauces of the Carolinas, in the tang of certain greens preparations, in the fermented corn that showed up in drinks made in the quarters that the plantation records don't mention. The knowledge of fermentation is one of the things that makes African foodways so distinctive and so resilient. Fermentation doesn't require refrigeration. It doesn't require specialized equipment. It requires time, warmth, salt, and knowledge of what's happening as the microbes do their work. It is, in a very literal sense, a science. A complex biological process managed through observational knowledge accumulated over generations. The women who kept this knowledge alive in the plantation quarters were doing something that a food scientist today would recognize as sophisticated. They didn't have the vocabulary of microbiology, but they had something arguably more valuable: the accumulated practical wisdom of a tradition that had been refined over centuries of use. Water management knowledge also traveled across the ocean in this culinary tradition, though it tends not to show up in most accounts of soul food. The Gullah Geechee people of coastal South Carolina and Georgia maintained, remarkably, significant elements of the water management systems that West African rice farmers had developed over millennia. Late in 2024, underwater sonar mapping revealed 45 previously unknown irrigation devices constructed by Gullah Geechee, ancestors to control water flow for rice cultivation. Earthen dams, levees, and channel systems covering 2,000 acres of one North Carolina island. This wasn't improvised. This was applied engineering, carried in the minds and hands of people who were supposed to be incapable of such things. The irony of the rice economy of colonial South Carolina is almost too stark to sit with comfortably. The planters advertised for enslaved people from the rice coast because they knew those people had the knowledge to make their plantations profitable. They used that knowledge to build fortunes so massive that Charleston became one of the wealthiest cities in the world. South Carolina rice made the colony so rich that it was contributing disproportionately to the early American economy. And then, when the rice economy eventually wound down after the Civil War, the official history credited the planters with building it, and the people whose agricultural genius actually made it possible were left out of the account entirely. The profit margin on rice plantation operations ran as high as 26%. The people whose knowledge drove that profit received not a penny of it. Now let's talk about something that usually gets left out of the soul food conversation: the extraordinary diversity within the tradition itself. Soul food is not one thing. It never was. The food of the Georgia Sea Islands is different from the food of Mississippi Delta sharecroppers, which is different from the food of black communities in Louisiana, which is different again from the food that great migration communities developed in Chicago and Detroit and New York. What binds them is not a set of dishes but a set of values: resourcefulness, communal feeding, the honoring of roots, the transformation of limited ingredients through skill and time and care. The specific dishes that express those values varied enormously by region, by the specific West African and Central African backgrounds of the people in a given community, by what was locally available. by the particular encounters and exchanges that happened in each place. Louisiana is the most dramatic example of this diversity. Creole and Cajun cooking are both deeply influenced by African culinary tradition, but they developed in a specific context. A French colony with a large free black population, unusual in the American South, where free people of color occupied a distinct social position and exercised a degree of economic and cultural autonomy that was rare elsewhere. African women in New Orleans were famous as the regalouses, the sellers of sweets and savory foods in the market. The callus, the rice fritters sold on street corners in the mornings, the beignets, the pralines. These are black women's commercial food products, sold in an urban market, a tradition that stretched from the colonial era through the 19th century. And gumbo, that dish that is the most direct embodiment of the African, indigenous, French, and Spanish culinary synthesis that makes Louisiana cooking unique, was very likely developed by African women in New Orleans kitchens in the 18th century. The word gumbo, the okra that gives it body, the seasoning philosophy, all of it carries African fingerprints. The filet powder that thickens certain gumbo preparations comes from the sassafras plant and was a contribution of the Choctaw people. Evidence that the culinary story we're tracing tonight is never only about one group of people. Indigenous knowledge fed into this tradition too, and there were specific exchanges and collaborations between enslaved people and indigenous people in the South that shaped what ended up on the table. The specific history is complicated and contested, but the food record is clear. What became soul food was a synthesis, a collision of traditions under conditions of extreme constraint, and the people who made it possible came from multiple directions. But it is also important to be clear and to push back against a version of this story that sometimes shows up in popular food history. The African contribution is not just one ingredient in a multicultural mixture. It is the foundation, the techniques, the flavor philosophy, the seasoning logic, the structural approach to what a meal is and how it should be built. This comes primarily from African tradition. The other contributions are real, but they are layers on top of a base that is fundamentally African. The one-pot philosophy, the slow cooking method, the way seasoning is used not just to add flavor, but to build complexity, the communal structure of eating. These are not neutral American things that various groups contributed to equally. They are African things that traveled to America in the minds and bodies of people who were forced to come here. And they are the reason American food tastes the way it does. Now you are moving through time, and the kitchen around you is changing. The fire is the same, the iron pot is the same, but the world outside the kitchen door is shifting. It is 1870, and you are free, at least legally. The word is new and still tender in your mouth. The reality is complicated in ways that the word doesn't fully prepare you for. You are in the South, in one of the black communities that began forming almost immediately after emancipation. Small, tight, organized around a church, building towards something that everyone can feel but nobody can quite name yet. Your cooking is still the center of the community's life. What changes in freedom, in terms of food, is access, not abundance. That would come slowly, and for many, it would never come fully. But access to choice. You can decide what to plant. You can decide what to sell and what to keep. You can cook for yourself first, and for the community on your own terms. The church dinner that you help organize every third Sunday is not an act of subsistence. It is an act of celebration, of community building. of demonstrating that this group of people has a culture worth celebrating. The food carries all of that meaning. Every plate of fried chicken, every bowl of butter beans, every slice of sweet potato pie is a small declaration of continuity. We were here, we survived, we are here still. The economics of soul food in the post-emancipation period are a story of both constraint and creativity. The sharecropping system kept most black Southern families in poverty, and the food they ate reflected those material limitations. But even within those constraints, the culinary tradition kept evolving. New combinations emerged, new variations on old techniques. The specific character of deep South soul food, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, crystallized in this period as communities that had been forming their identities under slavery now had the chance to formalize what they ate and how they ate it as expressions of who they were. The country store and the commissary played a complex role in this story. In the sharecropping system, black families often got their staples: cornmeal, fatback, molasses, dried beans, from the plantation commissary or the nearby country store, usually on credit that was deducted from their crop share. The system was designed to keep families in debt, and it largely succeeded. But even in this constrained economy, there was a room for the specific choices that build a culinary culture. Which variety of dried beans you preferred, how you seasoned your cornmeal, whether you cooked your greens with a smoked hock or with fresh pork or without pork at all. These choices, made in poverty, were still choices. They still express something. The black church dinner tradition deserves more sustained attention than it usually gets in food history, because it is one of the primary mechanisms by which soul food tradition was preserved, transmitted, and elevated across generations. Picture a church homecoming in rural Alabama, 1895. The congregation has been gathering for a morning service that runs 3 hours and leaves everyone spiritually fed and physically hungry. Outside, the women of the church have been cooking since the night before. There are long tables set up in the churchyard. On those tables are the full expression of what a community can do with the resources at hand when it is trying to feed everyone well. Pot after pot of slow-cooked greens, multiple preparations of pork, fried chicken in quantities suggesting that a significant number of chickens made a significant sacrifice for today's occasion, sweet potato pie and pound cake and tea cakes, and a coconut cake that someone's grandmother has been baking since before anyone can remember, butter beans and field peas and rice and cornbread, lemonade in a tin wash tub with a big block of ice if the season is right. This is not a potluck in the sense that anyone is bringing whatever they felt like making. This is an organized expression of what the community knows how to make. Each person who contributes is demonstrating mastery of specific dishes. The woman who always brings the sweet potato pie brings it because she makes the best sweet potato pie, because she has been making it for 40 years, because her mother taught her and her mother's mother taught her mother, because the recipe in her hands is old and true, and nobody has to be told that it is good. The fried chicken comes from the woman whose fried chicken is worth making a special trip for. The pound cake, that dense, fine-crumbed butter yellow cake that is one of the overlooked masterpieces of the American baking tradition, comes from the woman who has the touch for it. The pound cake itself is worth a moment. It's a cake that developed in European baking tradition, a pound each of flour, butter, eggs, and sugar. But in black Southern baking, the pound cake became something more than a technical exercise. It became a measure of a cook's skill. Getting the crumb right, getting the rise right, getting the flavor deep and buttery without heaviness. These require judgment that goes beyond any recipe. The pound cakes baked in black church kitchens and family homes were often better than any professional bakery's version, because the people baking them had been doing it their whole lives, and the stakes of doing it badly, disappointing your grandmother, failing to live up to the standard set at last year's homecoming, were real. The same can be said of every dish on that homecoming table. This is cooking that has been through serious quality control, not by professional critics, not by restaurant reviewers, but by communities of people who knew exactly what these dishes were supposed to taste like and who were quick to notice when they didn't. The competitive tradition of church cooking, the informal hierarchy of who makes the best version of each dish, functioned as a kind of culinary peer review. It kept standards high. It drove innovation at the margins while maintaining the core traditions. And it ensured that the knowledge kept passing down, because the women whose cooking was most admired were the ones younger women sought out to learn from. Let's talk about the economics one more time, because there's a story here that connects directly to the broader history of Black American economic life. In the years after emancipation, food was one of the primary arenas in which Black women could build economic independence. The tradition of Black women selling food, the street vendors of New Orleans, the fried chicken sellers at railroad stations, the market women of southern cities, became, in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, something larger. Black women opened restaurants, not just in Black neighborhoods, but in the limited commercial spaces available to them, reaching customers both within and across racial lines. These early restaurateurs were building something on the culinary knowledge they had spent lifetimes developing, transforming it into economic power in a context designed to deny them economic power at every turn. The railroad chicken sellers deserve particular recognition in this history. As the railroad network expanded through the post-Civil War South, the stops where trains took on water and passengers took on food became small commercial ecosystems. At station after station throughout the South, Black women were positioned on the platforms selling food to travelers, sandwiches, cooked meats, pies, fried chicken in particular. Travelers who knew anything about the route knew which station stops had the best food, and the reputation of individual women vendors spread through word of mouth on the trains. These women were operating informal food service businesses with no legal protection, no contract, no guarantee of their spot on the platform, and in many cases, active hostility from the railroad companies that wanted to replace them with dining cars operated by the railroad. They held their ground for decades. The fried chicken that became standard railroad food, that eventually became standard American comfort food, traveled on the reputation of these women's work. The Great Migration, which we mentioned briefly, requires a closer look in this context. The northward movement of Black Americans beginning around 1910 is usually told as a story of industrial labor and urban community formation. And it is those things. But it is also a story about food, about what it means to take a regional cuisine built around specific ingredients and specific traditions and suddenly transplant it into an urban environment where those ingredients aren't available at the corner store, where you're cooking in a tenement kitchen instead of over an open fire, where the collard greens you can find at the market in Chicago's South Side are a different variety than the ones your mother grew in Georgia. Migrants adapted. They always had. The resourcefulness that had shaped soul food in the plantation era, the ability to work with what was available while maintaining the essential character of what you were making, turned out to be exactly the right toolkit for cooking in a new city. The one-pot philosophy translated to a smaller kitchen. The seasoning traditions translated to whatever could be found. The communal eating tradition translated into the kitchen of the building's matriarch, the woman on the first floor, who always made enough for whoever came by, who could stretch a pot of beans farther than any supermarket would have suggested was possible. In northern cities, soul food restaurants became something beyond just places to eat. They were cultural anchors. The restaurant where you could get food that tasted like home was the place where you processed your displacement, where you reconnected with the South you'd left, whether you'd left it eagerly or reluctantly or both, and where you found community among people who understood what the food meant. The smell of greens cooking in a southern restaurant on a cold Chicago evening was something that could physically undo a homesick person. It was, and it remains, one of the most powerful things that food can do: carry a place across a distance. Harlem in the 1920s and 1930s became a crucible of both cultural production and culinary culture. The Harlem Renaissance, that extraordinary flowering of Black American art, music, literature, and intellectual life, had a food dimension that doesn't always get included in the account. The rent parties that funded community life in Harlem, gatherings where neighbors paid a small admission fee that went to help pay someone's rent, were always accompanied by food. Southern food: fried chicken, potato salad, collard greens, cornbread, sweet potato pie. The women who cooked for these parties were not casual cooks. They were serious practitioners who understood that the food was part of the event's value, that people would come back for the food as much as for the music and the company. At the same time, in Harlem and in black neighborhoods throughout northern cities, a new version of the debate about soul food was beginning to stir. One that would intensify in the 1960s and has continued in various forms to the present day. If soul food was born in the constraints of slavery, if the emphasis on pork fat and slow-cooked greens and fried starches was a response to poverty and rationing, was it still the right food for a black community trying to build health and economic stability and freedom? Was eating the food of slavery a form of cultural pride or a form of internalized oppression? Was it a celebration of resilience or a continued adaptation to deprivation? This debate is real, and it is serious, and it has produced genuine tension in black communities for more than a century. The Nation of Islam, beginning in the 1930s and expanding significantly in the 1960s, explicitly rejected soul food on theological and health grounds. Elijah Muhammad's book, How to Eat to Live, argued that pork and other traditional soul food staples were unhealthy and spiritually degrading. The Afrocentric cooking movement that developed alongside Black Power politics looked for alternatives rooted in pre-slavery African food traditions: less pork, more plant-based proteins, grains like sorghum and millet that connected to African heritage rather than plantation rations. These critiques were not wrong about the health consequences of certain traditional preparations. The disproportionate rates of hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease in Black American communities are real and complex, and the centuries-long diet of foods high in sodium and saturated fat contributed to those disparities. But here's the thing: the critique that says traditional soul food is unhealthy has to grapple with a historical irony that is enormous. The original West African diets from which soul food descended were, in large part, healthier than what the plantation system imposed. West African cooking was heavily plant-based. Greens, legumes, root vegetables, grains, fruits. These were the foundation. Meat was present but not dominant. The emphasis on pork fat and salted, cured meats that characterizes the most traditional soul food wasn't African. It was imposed. It was the result of being given pork scraps as your primary protein. The health consequences of soul food are not a product of African culinary tradition. They're a product of what slavery did to African culinary tradition. Contemporary chefs and food activists working within Black American culinary culture have been recovering that older tradition with increasing energy and sophistication. The use of smoked turkey instead of salt pork, plant-based preparations of traditional dishes, the reintroduction of sorghum, millet, and other grains associated with West African cooking. Chefs like Michael Twitty, whose book, The Cooking Gene, is one of the most remarkable pieces of food writing of the 21st century, have dedicated themselves to tracing the specific lines that connect African culinary heritage to American food. Jessica B. Harris, whose work High on the Hog became a Netflix series, has spent decades mapping the African origins of American cuisine. These are not just academic projects. They are acts of reclamation, insisting that the full story be told, that the genius of African cooks be given its proper name. And there is something else worth naming here. The extraordinary degree to which American food culture broadly, not just Black American food culture, rests on African foundations that have been systematically unacknowledged. The most iconic American foods, the ones that show up on every list of things that make America's culinary culture distinctive. Barbecue, fried chicken, mac and cheese, sweet potato pie, gumbo, jambalaya, hoppin' john, catfish, hot sauce, cornbread, the flavors of the American South that have gone global, that show up in restaurants from London to Tokyo. They came from Black kitchens. They were developed and perfected by Black hands under conditions of extreme constraint, and then carried north and eventually around the world by communities who had been told their culture was inferior. You can't separate American food from African American food. You can't draw a line between Southern cuisine and soul food and stand on either side of it and say these are distinct things. They are the same roots. They grew from the same kitchens. The difference is only in who gets the credit. Let's go back to the iron pot one more time. Let's go back to you, standing in that kitchen in 1820. And let me tell you what you know. You know that the okra in this pot came from seeds that someone brought across an ocean in the darkest possible circumstances. You know that the technique you're using to cook it, the slow simmer, the way the heat pulls the natural thickener out of the pods and makes the liquid silk, came from a culinary tradition older than this country. You know that the pepper you added, the hot and bright sting of it that cuts through the richness of the pork, comes from a flavor philosophy developed on a continent most of the people in this house will never see. You know all of this, not as abstract history, but as inherited knowledge, as the specific wisdom passed to you by a specific woman on a specific morning that you can still see clearly when you close your eyes. You don't know, because how could you, that what you're making in this pot will travel, that it will go north, that it will go west, that it will show up in cities that don't exist, yet cooked by people who haven't been born yet, carrying the memory of this kitchen in its flavor, even when no one eating it knows where the flavor came from. You don't know that the country will steal your technique and forget your name, and put it on restaurant menus without acknowledgement. You don't know any of that. What you know is that this meal has to be made, that the people who eat it tonight will need to be fed, and that you know how to feed them. That knowledge was never taken. It couldn't be. They took everything else. They took the credit for it. They built an industry on it. But the knowledge itself, the specific understanding of how to transform something humble into something that nourishes people, body and soul, that lived in the hands and minds of the cooks, passed from woman to woman, generation to generation, carried across geography and time in the specific way that a dish tastes when it's made by someone who learned it from someone who learned it from someone who learned it in a kitchen that no longer exists, but is still somehow present in every pot. This is what soul food means. Not a list of dishes, not a regional cuisine, a living document, a set of instructions passed forward by people who wanted the people who came after them to know. Here is how you make something from very little. Here is how you feed your community. Here is how you keep the memory of where you came from alive in the flavor of what you make today. Here is how you survive. The Sunday dinners that continue in black families across America today. The great-grandmother's potato salad that nobody can replicate exactly. The aunt whose fried chicken the whole family drives for. The sweet potato pie that shows up at Thanksgiving and Christmas and funerals and homecomings and every occasion that matters. These are not nostalgia. They are living tradition. They are the current expression of a continuous stream of knowledge and love that has been flowing since before the United States existed. The flavors in that food are old. They traveled an ocean. They survived bondage. They fed communities that had nothing else feeding them. They outlasted the systems designed to erase them. And every time someone sits down to a meal built from those traditions, every time a family comes together around a table and the food is good and the room smells like something that means something, they are inheritors of one of the greatest acts of cultural preservation in human history, carried not in libraries or museums or official records, but in the specific knowledge of how to make something taste the way it's supposed to taste. The tradition is yours. The credit always was. Now it is late, and the fire in the kitchen has burned low. The pots are still warm. The meal has been made and eaten, and the plates have been cleared. Outside, the night is quiet. Inside, in the warmth of the remaining coals, in the smell of the herbs hanging from the walls and the sweet ghost of the sweet potato that someone put in the ashes to cook slowly through the night, there is something that the cruelty of the world outside this kitchen couldn't take, couldn't name, couldn't put a number to on a ledger or list on a bill of sale. There is pleasure here, the specific, defiant pleasure of people who made something beautiful from what they were given. Now let's take a wider tour through the kitchen, not just the one you're standing in, but the full geography of soul food's development. Because the story has regional chapters that are as rich as the main narrative, and each one adds a different dimension to what we're tracing tonight. The South Carolina and Georgia Low Country is, in many ways, the most direct line back to Africa. The Gullah Geechee people who developed there are the descendants of enslaved Africans who came from the Rice Coast, who were deliberately selected for their agricultural knowledge, and who, because of the geographic isolation of the sea islands, because malaria kept white planters away from the coast for much of the year, because the plantation system in the Low Country used a task-based system of labor that allowed for somewhat more autonomy than the gang labor of the cotton fields, managed to preserve more of their African cultural heritage than almost any other group of enslaved people in North America. The Gullah Geechee food tradition is one of the most directly African food traditions in the Americas. Rice is not just a staple, it is central to identity and ceremony. The ritual of washing rice, removing the darker grains, rinsing until the water runs clear, is a practice with direct parallels in West African rice cooking culture. The one-pot rice dishes, hoppin' john, red rice, okra rice, crab rice, follows structural patterns from West African cooking. The flat woven fanna baskets used for separating rice from its husks were made using techniques brought from West Africa. The baskets are beautiful. They are now considered art objects, sold in Charleston markets for hundreds of dollars. The technique that makes them was developed by enslaved people performing agricultural labor. The specific sweetgrass baskets of the Charleston Lowcountry, now made and sold by the descendants of the Gullah people, coiled grass sewn in the same patterns their ancestors used, are one of the most tangible surviving material artifacts of this direct cultural transmission. When you hold one of those baskets, you are holding something that has come in a reasonably straight line from pre-colonial West Africa, through the horror of the trade, through the brutality of the plantation, through emancipation and Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the 20th century. The technique survived all of that, passed hand to hand, mother to daughter, grandmother to grandchild. The sea island diet that developed in the Gullah Geechee communities is its own complete culinary universe. Seafood, shrimp, crab, oysters, fish of dozens of varieties, forms the backbone because the geography insists on it. Shrimp and grits, now fashionable in fine dining restaurants from New York to London, is a Gullah breakfast dish, a simple, hearty morning meal of shrimp caught that morning, cooked with whatever fat and seasoning was available, served over stone-ground corn grits. The upscaling of this dish, the truffle and lobster variations on restaurant menus in the 2000s, is one of the more comic examples of culinary appropriation in recent history. The dish was a working fisherman's breakfast. The people paying $35 for it in Manhattan restaurants might not know that, but the Gullah women who fed their families on it for generations certainly did. Gullah food also preserves specific West African flavor combinations that are sometimes more muted in other branches of soul food. The use of benna, sesame, is a direct African inheritance. Beni seeds appear in West African cooking in both sweet and savory applications, and in the Gullah tradition, they show up in cookies called benna wafers, in soups and stews, in preparations that have no exact counterpart elsewhere in southern cooking. The use of dried, smoked and fermented seafood for seasoning, reminiscent of the fermented fish paste and dried fish that appear throughout West African cooking, is another Gullah signature. The flavor profile is unmistakably connected to its origins. Let's move west and north. The food traditions of the black communities in the Mississippi Delta have their own particular character, shaped by the specific agriculture of the region. Primarily cotton, which unlike rice required no particular expertise that the planters didn't already have, which meant that Delta plantation communities were formed from people from many different African regions, creating a cultural mixing that was more heterogeneous than the Low Country. Delta soul food is, if anything, even more elemental than the Low Country version. The emphasis on pork in every possible form, on slow-cooked greens, on cornmeal in every application, on dried beans that cook all day and taste like they've been cooking for centuries. The Delta is also where the blues emerged, and the relationship between blues music and soul food is not coincidental. Both are products of the same communities, expressing the same experience through different mediums. The blues and the food share a quality that is hard to name precisely, but that everyone who has encountered them recognizes. A kind of richness that comes from acknowledging difficulty without being defeated by it. A beauty that exists in tension with sorrow, rather than in opposition to it. The slow, deep, smoky flavor of Delta soul food and the slow, deep, smoky sound of Delta blues. These come from the same people and the same history, and they resonate with each other in a way that feels almost inevitable. New Orleans, as I mentioned earlier, deserves its own chapter and could easily fill an entire script on its own. The city's food culture is one of the most complex and most rewarding in the world, and the African contribution to it is so fundamental that it's almost impossible to extract. It's woven through everything. Let me give you a few specific examples of what I mean. Gumbo, the most iconic New Orleans dish, is a syncretic masterpiece. The name is African. The okra that thickens the file-based version is African. The technique of building a flavor base by first cooking your aromatics, the onion, celery, and bell pepper combination called the Holy Trinity, in fat is a French technique. The roux that gives certain gumbos their deep, nutty foundation is French technique applied with an African patience for long, careful cooking. The filet powder that thickens and flavors the other version comes from the Choctaw people. The shrimp and crab and oysters that fill it come from the Louisiana coast. And the specific combination, the specific flavor philosophy, the decision to make all these things work together, that came from the black women cooking in New Orleans kitchens in the 18th century. Jambalaya is another case. It's often described as the American counterpart to Spanish paella, and there's a historical connection there. But the version most people eat, the dirty, deep-flavored, slow-cooked rice dish, carries far more resemblance to West African jollof rice than to anything Spanish. Jollof rice is a West African dish of rice cooked in a spiced tomato base with meat or fish, a one-pot meal with clear similarities to jambalaya's rice cooked in spiced broth, with meat and vegetables. The specific path from one to the other is debated by culinary historians, but the flavor logic is recognizable across the distance. Red beans and rice on Monday in New Orleans is a tradition that dates to the days when Monday was laundry day, a day when the women of the household couldn't tend a complicated meal because they were working at the wash tub all day. Red beans required almost no active cooking. You put them on with a ham bone or hock, you kept the fire low, you let them go for hours. At the end of a long day of laundry, dinner was ready. This dish became so associated with New Orleans Monday that Louis Armstrong reportedly signed his letters, "Red beans and ricely yours." It is soul food at its most practical and most perfect. Cheap ingredients, minimal equipment, maximum flavor. The result of long, slow application of heat and time. The pralines that New Orleans street vendors sell today, the sweet, creamy, pecan-laden confections wrapped in paper and sold from baskets in the French Quarter, are the direct descendants of the sweets sold by free black women in New Orleans in the early 19th century and before. The Creole candy sellers who worked the markets and the streets were known for sweets that combined African flavor, traditions with French technique, and Southern ingredients. Pralines, callas, beignets. The sweet food culture of New Orleans has deep roots in the commercial work of black women who built small economies in the margins of a city that was simultaneously one of the most sophisticated and most brutally enslaved places in North America. New Orleans had the largest population of free black people of any southern city, and those free black people participated in the city's food economy with a sophistication and a commercial reach that was unique in the antebellum South. Now I want to spend a little time with the specific mechanics of soul food cooking, because they deserve more than a passing mention. The techniques that define soul food are not simple. They require time, attention, and a form of knowledge that is primarily practical, learned by doing, by watching, by failing and adjusting and trying again. Let me walk you through a few of them. Slow braising. This is perhaps the most fundamental technique of soul food. and it is the technique that transforms the unpromising cuts, the tough, collagen-rich, sinewy pieces that require long cooking, into something magnificent. The physics of braising are straightforward. You cook tough meat in a small amount of liquid at a low temperature for a long time, and the collagen in the connective tissue breaks down into gelatin, which thickens the braising liquid and gives the meat a silky, yielding texture. But understanding the physics doesn't tell you how to do it. Knowing how to do it requires understanding the specific smell that tells you the heat is right, the specific look of the liquid when it's doing what it should do, the specific resistance of the meat when you press it at different points in the cooking, and what that resistance means. This knowledge lives in the hands and nose and eyes. It doesn't live in a recipe. Frying. Soul food frying is a specific thing, and it is not the same as the industrial scale frying that appears in fast food. Soul food fried chicken involves seasoning the raw chicken, sometimes overnight, sometimes for days, with a mixture of salt, pepper, and spices that varies by cook and family and region. The specific seasoning mixture is often proprietary in the sense that the cook who developed it guards it carefully, teaches it selectively, and expects it to outlast her. The coating is seasoned flour, sometimes with other additions, a touch of cornmeal for texture, a pinch of garlic powder, paprika for color, cayenne for heat. The fat, traditionally lard, now more often vegetable oil, has to be at the right temperature, hot enough that the chicken sizzles immediately when it goes in, cool enough that the coating doesn't burn before the meat cooks through, getting the temperature right, keeping it right through the cooking process, knowing when the chicken is done. All of this requires the same kind of embodied knowledge as braising. Seasoning. The art of seasoning in soul food is a subject that could fill a book. The general principle is layering. You don't add all your seasoning at the end. You season at every stage. You season the meat before it cooks. You season the oil before you add the vegetables. You season the liquid before you add the solid ingredients. You taste as you go, and you make adjustments. And the adjustments are not from a recipe, but from your understanding of where the dish needs to be and what it's lacking. The depth of flavor in properly made soul food. The way a pot of greens can taste like it contains more ingredients than it actually does. The way a properly seasoned piece of fried chicken is more than the sum of its parts, comes from this patient, attentive layering of flavor over time. These are not intuitive skills. They are learned skills, passed from cook to cook in the intimate setting of a shared kitchen. The primary vehicle of transmission is not a recipe, but a presence. You stand next to the person who knows. You watch what they do. You feel the heat they're using. You smell what they smell. You taste what they taste. And gradually, you begin to internalize the knowledge they're expressing. This is how the tradition transmitted itself under slavery, when written recipes would have been both useless. Many enslaved people were legally prohibited from learning to read, and inadequate, because the knowledge is largely tacit, inexpressible in words. And this is how it continues to transmit itself in grandmothers' kitchens and church halls and barbecue pits. One cook teaching another by example. The social dimensions of this transmission are worth examining. The teaching of cooking within black families has not historically been gender neutral, and that deserves acknowledgement. The knowledge of soul food cooking was primarily held and transmitted by women, and those women were often doing the work of feeding communities under conditions of profound constraint. The grandmother who cooked for 3 generations is a figure that appears again and again in black family histories, and the knowledge she held, the specific knowledge of how to make specific things, adapted to the resources available, calibrated to the needs of the people she was feeding, was a form of community service as much as a domestic responsibility. There is a word that gets used in food scholarship that I think captures something essential here: foodways. It means not just the dishes that a community eats, but the entire social and cultural framework around how food is produced, prepared, shared, and given meaning. Soul Food's foodways are as important as Soul Food's recipes. The ritual of the Sunday dinner, the understanding that you always make enough for whoever shows up, whether or not you knew they were coming. The specific occasion dishes, the food reserved for funerals, the food that appears at homecomings, the food that means celebration, and the food that means grief, and the food that means a regular Tuesday when everyone is tired and needs something that makes them feel less tired. These patterns of when to make what and how to make it for whom carry as much cultural information as the recipes themselves. The funeral repast deserves particular mention because it is one of the most vivid expressions of Soul Food's communal function. When someone dies in a black community, the community feeds the bereaved family. This is not a new practice. It goes back through generations, through church tradition, through the understanding developed in communities where death was always close and grief was always collective. That when people are too broken to feed themselves, the community feeds them. The dishes that appear at a funeral repast are usually the most comforting versions of the most traditional recipes, the most carefully made mac and cheese, the best fried chicken, the most properly seasoned greens, the pound cake that takes all day. The message of the food is explicit, even without words. We are here. We have made the best of what we have. We are feeding you. You matter to us. This practice, food as community care, cooking as an act of love with an explicitly social function, runs like a thread through every version of soul food, in every era, in every region. It is there in the quarters meal. It is there in the church dinner. It is there in the rent party. It is there in the Great Migration restaurants that smelled like home. It is there in the funeral repast. It is there in the family reunion table that groans under the weight of every dish that everyone always makes. The same dishes every year. The predictability of them a source of comfort rather than boredom. The specific pleasure of food that is the same every time. The aunt's potato salad that is always the exact same potato salad, year after year, and that everyone counts on being the exact same potato salad, is a kind of pleasure that is hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it. It's not about the food itself. It's about continuity. It's about the knowledge that some things persist, that some things can be relied upon, that the people who make these things will make them again next year and the year after, and that when they're gone, the recipe will survive because someone paid enough attention to learn it. In a history defined by ruptures, the Middle Passage, the auction block, Reconstruction's violent end, the terror of Jim Crow, the displacement of the Great Migration, the persistence of a recipe is not a small thing. It is proof of continuity. It is evidence that something was not taken. This has changed significantly in recent generations, as formal culinary culture has recognized and begun to honor the black contribution to American food, and as black men have become celebrated for continuing and innovating within soul food traditions. Chefs like Ed Lee, who works across the intersection of Korean and Southern American food and speaks openly about African culinary heritage. Brian Watts and his advocacy for the African roots of American barbecue. The brilliant, eccentric work of Michael Twitty, who cooks in historically accurate enslaved settings and writes about culinary genealogy. with the emotional power of someone personally reckoning with everything we've talked about tonight. These figures represent a contemporary engagement with this tradition that is both scholarly and deeply personal. Twitty's The Cooking Gene is worth mentioning at some length because it is one of the most important pieces of American food writing in decades. Twitty, who is black and Jewish and gay and from the Washington, D.C. area, traveled through the American South cooking traditional African American foods in historically accurate ways. Open fire, period equipment, enslaved recipes, and combining this culinary pilgrimage with genealogical research into his own ancestry, tracing where his family came from, what part of Africa, what specific ethnic and culinary traditions his ancestors carried. The book is a meditation on heritage and loss and recovery, on what it means to cook food that carries the memory of suffering, on the specific dignity of making something beautiful from what was given to people who were treated as less than human. Twitty's central argument, which he demonstrates through both historical research and physical practice, is that the story of African American cuisine is also the story of American cuisine, that you cannot understand what Americans eat and why it tastes the way it does without understanding the African contribution. This is not an ideological argument, it's an empirical one. The evidence is in the dishes, the flavor is in the food. Now I want to talk about something that has happened in more recent decades that is both wonderful and worth examining carefully: the high-end culinary world's discovery of soul food. Beginning in the 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s and 2010s, fine dining chefs began incorporating soul food elements into upscale menus. Shrimp and grits went from a gula breakfast dish to a $12 brunch staple. Braised short rib, which is just a fancy way of saying a tough cut braised until it yields, which is what soul food has always done, became a restaurant luxury item. Fried chicken appeared on tasting menus. Mac and cheese with artisanal cheese became a specialty. The specific flavors and techniques of soul food found their way into the highest tiers of American culinary culture. This happened, and it is genuinely complicated. On one hand, the recognition that these flavors and techniques are sophisticated, worthy of the same attention and investment that has always been given to French or Italian or Japanese culinary traditions, is overdue and important. On the other hand, the specific chefs who became wealthy and famous for innovating on soul food traditions were disproportionately white. The black restaurants and communities that had been maintaining and developing these traditions for generations rarely received the capital, the press coverage, or the James Beard nominations that went to the white chefs who brought the techniques into fine dining. The food traveled. The credit, again, did not follow the food to its source. This is changing, slowly. The culinary establishment has become more attentive, partly under pressure and partly through genuine evolution, to the need to credit origins, to support black-owned restaurants and black culinary voices, to tell the history accurately. The success of Jessica B. Harris's work, the attention that High on the Hog on Netflix received, the growing prominence of black food writers and critics, these are signs of movement. But the financial infrastructure of the food industry, who gets restaurant loans, who gets press coverage, who gets featured in food magazines, who gets invited to cook at the events that make careers, still reflects historical inequities that a few good documentary series can't undo on their own. Here is what I want you to understand as we move toward the end of tonight's conversation. Soul food is not a static tradition. It was never static. It began as a set of adaptations to brutal circumstances, and it has been adapting ever since. The Great Migration changed it. The Civil Rights era changed it. The health debates of the 1970s and 1980s changed it. The contemporary recovery of West African culinary roots is changing it again. What makes it soul food is not any specific dish or any specific set of ingredients. What makes it soul food is the underlying philosophy that you feed people with everything you have, that the meal is for the community, not just for the individual, that the knowledge of how to cook is precious and should be passed on, that the memory of where you came from lives in what you make, that pleasure and nourishment and care are not luxuries, they are necessary. They are what it means to insist, against everything designed to tell you otherwise, that you are worth feeding. The sweet potato is still in the coals. It has been cooking slowly all night. In the morning, it will come out soft and steaming, its skin charred and fragile, its flesh dense and sweet. Someone will split it open and season it with whatever is available. It will be eaten standing up in the brief window before the day's labor begins. It will taste to the person eating it like warmth, like survival, like all the mornings that came before this one. That taste is the thing that survived everything. That's the thing we've been tracing all night. And there's one more thing I want you to know before we come in for a landing, because it's the part of this story that tends to get lost in the broader conversation about food history and culinary appropriation. The tradition is not finished. It is not a museum piece. It is not something that lives only in memory and in old cookbooks and in the mouths of people who remember their grandmother's kitchens. It is alive right now in the thousands of black cooks and chefs and home kitchens and church halls and family reunion tables and barbecue pits across America, doing what it has always done, which is feeding people and carrying memory and adapting to new circumstances without losing its essential character. Contemporary black chefs are doing extraordinary things with this inheritance. Some are working within the tradition almost reverentially, mastering and preserving specific regional preparations that are in danger of being lost as the generations who learned them directly from their elders grow older. Others are pushing the tradition forward, combining West African ingredients and techniques with influences from the broader African diaspora, from the Caribbean and Brazil and West Africa directly, making dishes that honor the roots of soul food while extending them into territory that the original practitioners couldn't have imagined. Still others are doing the important work of making the health narrative honest and actionable, developing preparations of traditional dishes that use the deep flavor palette of soul food while reducing the specific health consequences of the ingredients that the plantation system imposed. Smoked turkey instead of salt pork, red palm oil in place of lard, more legumes, more greens, more grain. These are not betrayals of the tradition. They are continuations of its most fundamental logic, which is, you work with what you have, and you make it good, and you feed people. There is also a growing movement of black food entrepreneurs building the commercial infrastructure that was denied to the railroad chicken sellers and the rent party cooks and the church hall bakers. Restaurants owned and financed by black people in black communities, with the capital to grow and the visibility to be recognized. Food halls and pop-ups and market stalls, cookbook deals and television shows. And increasingly, a critical food press that is learning, slowly, to center black culinary voices rather than treating them as colorful additions to a narrative that remains fundamentally organized around European and white American food culture. The story is not over. It is still being written in every kitchen where a grandmother teaches a grandchild how to season greens without measuring, in every barbecue pit where a pitmaster manages a fire with the same attention that his predecessors managed the fire in the quarters. In every church hall where women organize a dinner that feeds several hundred people with a precision and a warmth that any professional caterer would recognize as mastery. The ingredients themselves carry memory. When a cook reaches for okra at a market in South Carolina, that okra is a descendant of seeds that crossed the Atlantic in the most terrible conditions imaginable. When a Louisiana pitmaster seasons a rack of ribs with a dry rub built from hot pepper and salt and dark sugar and smoke, the proportions in that rub carry the echo of West African seasoning philosophy, modified over generations to suit new woods and new meats and new palates, but fundamentally recognizable as something older than America. When a grandmother in Mississippi cooks a pot of butter beans with a ham hock, the technique, the patience, the low heat, the long time, the way she seasons not at the end but at every stage, comes from a tradition of cooking legumes that stretches back to West Africa. These dishes are documents. They are living archives. They hold information that is nowhere else preserved. Some of the specific details of the cultures that created them have been lost in the violence of the trade and the generations of enforced silence that followed. But the food survived, and in surviving, it preserved something real. A fragment of a philosophy, a whisper of a way of understanding what eating is for and what cooking means. The knowledge is old. The people carrying it forward are not. Think about this the next time you sit down to a meal that carries the flavors we've been talking about tonight. Think about okra in your gumbo and where it came from. Think about the seasoning on your fried chicken and the philosophy behind it. Think about the long, slow, patient cooking that goes into a proper pot of greens and what that patience was originally an adaptation to. Think about the communities that gathered around these dishes and found in them, across centuries of attempts to erase their culture and deny their humanity, something that couldn't be taken. Think about the cook, usually a woman, often unacknowledged, working with insufficient resources in difficult conditions, who made sure that the food was good, who made sure that whatever was put on the table had enough care in it to carry people through whatever the next day was going to bring. Soul food tastes the way it does because it was made by people who understood, at a level too deep for words, that food is love, that feeding people is an assertion of their worth, that the transformation of difficult ingredients through skill and time and care is one of the oldest forms of human artistry, and that this particular form of artistry, developed over centuries of extraordinary constraint, is one of the most remarkable achievements in American cultural history. It just took the history books a very long time to say so. Tonight, at least, you know. Tonight, you've traveled a long way. You've gone back to the rice coast of West Africa and watched the Mende and the Baga farm rice in ways that would build colonial empires they never benefited from. You followed seeds braided into hair across the horror of the Middle Passage and watched them get planted in small garden plots on the margins of plantations that were making other people rich. You've stood in the kitchen where James Hemings cooked for founding fathers who took credit for the dishes he created and then held his freedom hostage to ensure the knowledge stayed in their possession. You've sat by the fire in the quarters while slow-cooked greens and cornbread, and whatever the creek gave up today became the meal that a community needed to survive the next day. You've watched the tradition travel north in the Great Migration, take root in Harlem rent parties and Chicago storefront restaurants, hold steady through the debates of the 60s about whether eating the food of slavery was something to be proud of. You've traced the roots of fried chicken and hot sauce and gumbo and mac and cheese and sweet potato pie, all the way back to the continent that gave American cuisine most of its soul. Here's what you should take away from tonight, and I want you to hold it. Every time someone describes a particular flavor as quintessentially American and doesn't mention Africa, there's a story missing. Every time a chef is praised for bringing bold seasoning and deep, slow-cooked flavor to a dish, and the tradition that developed those techniques over centuries isn't credited, there's an erasure happening. And every time someone sits down to a meal that carries those flavors, whether they know the history or not, they are the beneficiaries of an act of genius performed by people who were told repeatedly that genius was something they weren't capable of. They proved otherwise. In iron pots over wood fires, with rations designed to be insufficient, in the small hours of the morning before the field horn blew, with seeds carried in their hair across the worst crossing imaginable. They proved otherwise. Whisper a quiet thank you tonight, not to a recipe, not to a restaurant, to the women who cooked without cookbooks, to the men who kept the fire going, to the children who watched and learned and carried it forward, to the communities that gathered around those meals and affirmed, through the act of eating, together, that they were worth feeding, that they mattered, that no ledger, no law, no enforced poverty would take from them the knowledge of how to make something good. They cooked so that you could eat. They preserved so that you could remember. They fed so that you could continue. Close your eyes now. Let the warmth of the hearth settle over you. Let the smell of whatever is slow cooking in your memory. Something your grandmother made. Something that tastes like a specific afternoon, a specific room, a specific feeling of being cared for. Let that smell be the last thing you carry into sleep tonight. The tradition lives in you, whether you know it or not. It is in every meal you've ever loved. It is in every moment of warmth that a shared table has ever given you. It came a long way to find you. Rest well. They ran so that you could.